Well, first, they're the only four Gold Star family of World War II. And again, the most, I suppose, the word disappointing thing about it is nobody knows their name. And what drove me was I just couldn't understand how a family could lose so much in any war, but during World War II, how they could lose so much and nobody knows their name.
You're listening to the Stories Behind the Stars podcast, and I'm your host, Tatiana Fallon. This podcast is run by the organization Stories Behind the Stars. We have the goal of writing a story for every American service member killed during World War II. That's over 420,000. We are accomplishing this goal through amazing volunteers who you will hear in this podcast as they research and write these stories. If you're at all interested in becoming a volunteer and researching and writing these stories, please check us out at storiesbehindthestars.org. Thank you so much for your time, and I hope you enjoy this amazing content that we're finding. Today's episode is part one of a two-part episodes with researcher and author Mark Hutson. He recently published a book called So Costly a Sacrifice. I would go check it out. I'll put the link in the description below. Definitely worth the read. I read it. It was phenomenal. Like all of our authors, well worth the time. Welcome to this episode of the podcast. Today I have the honor and privilege of speaking with researcher and writer Mark Hutson. Mark, would you take a second and introduce yourself to our listeners?
Yes, well, and first of all, it's an honor and truly a privilege to be part of this. So I want to thank you. I want to thank you so much for having me. And I am an Army veteran of 7 years. I served from 1981 to 87, which seems like such a long time ago. I'm a graduate of Army Airborne School, Army Air Assault School, and the Drill Instructor Academy at Fort Benning in Georgia. After graduating the academy, I served as a DI at Fort Benning for 2 years. And I always tell people it was probably the hardest, two of the hardest years of my life. And people say, well, how could it be the hardest 2 years of your life? It should be the other way around. And then in 87, I was honorably discharged, and I moved back to Harvard, Illinois, where I currently reside. And I began my career at an electrical equipment manufacturer in Chicago, where I'm still today after 33 years, and currently serve as the vice president. So that's the work side of it for the most part. And Christine, my wife of 32 years, she and I have we have an antique business, and where we specialize in architectural and industrial antiques, and we do markets all over the country. Somewhat how I got into writing the book, but in 2012, I founded Service Flag Tradition. And it's really, it became a traveling program that I focused on three missions. One was to educate people on the history of the gold and the Blue Star service flag. Two, I often shared stories of veterans, of veterans that I had read, and actually those that we had met at several of our events. And also as a member of the Post 288 in Cedarburg, Wisconsin, I present service flags to family who currently have loved ones serving in armed forces. So, it's if you want to get an idea of what our events look like, I do have a website, which is serviceflagtradition.com. There's several pictures of an event that we held at Mequon, and it kind of gives you a good idea of how and what we set up at these events. So
So then what brought you to doing research about Gold Star family, and particularly the Borgstrom brothers?
Yeah, well, in terms of the service flag, it really, so I mentioned that my wife and I do antiques. And so 2012, we were actually taking a day off. It had been a long summer already, and we were taking a day off and just kind of traveling the back roads of Illinois. And in some ways, unfortunately, we came upon an auction sign, and I knew what that meant. I knew the day off was done. So we ended up going to this farm auction, and at this farm auction, there was an old dairy barn. And inside the dairy barn, there was a cabinet, an old primitive cabinet that we took interest in. And the funny thing, there was nothing in this cabinet whatsoever. And so my wife and I were kind of looking over the cabinet, opening the drawers and just checking it out. And as I opened up the bottom drawer, a flag had rolled forward in the drawer, and I unfurled the flag, and at the time, I'm ashamed to say, especially after serving 7 years in the military, I didn't exactly know what it was. I knew it had a connection to military service somehow, but I wasn't exactly sure. So I just felt the need that I had to have this service flag. So the service flag ended up costing us over $400 because I had to buy the cabinet to get the flag. And that night, when I got home, I started to dig into exactly what this flag meant and what it represented. And and so that then parlayed into I was just really focused on collecting service flags. And so after a couple years, the house is filled with bins and bins of service flags of every size and shape. And we started to travel with our collection. And so one of the stories, along with setting up this large display, like I mentioned, I would also tell stories of our veterans. And one of the stories that I often told was the Sullivan brothers. And one night I wanted to get just a little more detail about their story, and I started just researching on the computer, and I came across the name Borgstrom. And I had never heard this name. I had no idea who they were. And not that I'm some military historian, but I was just intrigued about their story. And what I suppose kind of bothered me most was the fact that, again, that I had never heard this name. And so I started researching their story. And so one of the thoughts that I had was, well, am I the only one that didn't hear of this family, that didn't know anything about this family? So as we held additional events, I started to ask the audience. I'd ask them two questions. Say, has anybody, by show of hands, how many people have heard of the Sullivan brothers? And I would often get a pretty good share of hands. And the follow-up question would be, okay, well, who here has heard of the Borgstroms? And I will say, in over 2 years at all the events that we have done, I never had one hand that was raised. And that really struck me. And quite honestly, it really bothered me. And I felt at that point, I felt that I needed to get their story out. And so to do that, I had to know more than what was just online. So my wife and I, we ended up traveling and taking our service flag display all the way out to Tremont in Utah. And before we went, I had talked to a lady out there. She's like a local historian, and I had asked her. I said, hey, if we come out and do this, I'd like to make 2 requests. And one request would be, could we get some home cooked meals after several days on the road? And the other request was, would it be possible to meet any of the members of the Borgstrom family? And she responded. She said, "Well, I can promise you home cooked meals, but she says I can't promise you that I can get any of the Borgstrom family members to come and meet you." So nothing ventured, nothing gained, and we took off, and it was a very expensive trip. We blew a transmission in Salt Lake City. That was $5,000, and but ultimately we made it to our destination, and we set up at a little community center. It was on a Friday, and the whole time, I'm just so curious of whether or not I was going to get the opportunity to meet any of the Borgstrom family members. So along comes Saturday morning, and people start to come into the community center. And as it turns out, I had the privilege of meeting about 15 to 20 of the Borgstrom family members, and it was just an unbelievable experience. And all day they took my wife Christine and I. They took us around to in this small town of Thatcher, Utah. It's north of Salt Lake City, about 100 miles, and they took us, to the home of the Borgstroms. They took us to the tabernacle where in 1948 they had the services for the sons, and then they took us to the Riverview Cemetery. And as we're standing at the gravesite of the mother and the father and the four boys, there was something that made me make a promise to Randy Borgstrom. Now, Randy Borgstrom there was one son that survived, and he had 5 children. And as we're standing there, I made a promise to Randy. I said, "Randy," I said, "I'm going to write the story about your family." And admittedly, I was way over my skis because I had never written anything in my life other than performance reviews. I had no idea what I was getting into, but I just knew that I had to do this, and that I would not let this family down. And so for the next 5 years, when we got home, I immediately started my research, and 5 years later, the book is So Costly a Sacrifice was published.
So for those that's like amazing story. I've driven across the United States 4 times, and it is quite the experience. It's not a very fun trip.
Yes.
So to lose a transmission in Salt Lake is horrible. But so to just real quick to our readers or listeners, who have never heard of the Borgstrom brothers, can you just tell us what exactly is why is their story so poignant and important story of World War II history?
Well, first, they're the only four Gold Star family of World War II. And again, the most, I suppose, the word disappointing thing about it is nobody knows their name. And what drove me was I just couldn't understand how a family could lose so much in any war, but during World War II, how they could lose so much and nobody knows their name. And they, I always say it's like, what it's what is, when they think about what is the book about, and I say, well, it's a true story about the Borgstrom family from World War II. And in less than 6 months, the mother and father experienced unspeakable loss when four of their 5 sons who served in the war were killed. It's also the story. It's about their one son who survived the war, but he struggled mightily his entire life after the war with endless guilt. And but it's also the story of a family they were deeply loved by their community, so much so that when their 5th son was known to be alive and still in the Marine Corps, their community, the Blue Star Mothers Organization of Utah, and politicians in Utah rallied in their cause to bring their one son home. And and then also it's a story about the surviving son, who years of struggling with survivor's guilt. He was finally able to overcome his troubles and redeem himself with the ones who loved him dearly. So there's a lot. I believe that there's a lot of lessons in the book. And one of the things that I was kind of struck by, I'm hoping I'm not getting off on a tangent on you, but one of the things that really struck me was, again, I'll mention Randy Borgstrom. I sent him a copy of the book, and in being transparent, over the years of writing, we had very little contact, and I understand that. But when the book was finally published, I sent him a copy of it to read, and not only did he send a beautiful letter of how much he appreciated what I had done, but he had said one of the things that kind of struck me. He said after reading your book, he said it really makes me want to be a better person. And so again, it's yes, it's the story about about the family, their loss, but I think there's some good lessons in the book too.
I really loved how beautifully you described their home life, what it was like, and what they really gave up when they lost these four sons was, they were close family. They had, they were all grew up and they were all pretty close in age, and like what that really was a sacrifice for them of losing their four sons of so close and so together. And maybe that's why, Boyd, I think his name is Boyd, right? The oldest, mm-hmm. Or I think, that survivor's guilt also tied with just that, grief. Like that was one thing when I talked to my grandma about losing her brother was, just sure. The grief that, you had such a close friend and, a sibling who was such a close friend that no longer can like talk to or grow up with or, enjoy those things as a family. And I think you did a beautiful job, kind of creating that. And to me, what it made me really want to do is just help my children have really good relationships with their siblings.
Yes.
Because I saw, even though it was super tragic to see what happened in the war, the strength that they did come from their tight bond as siblings. So that was inspiring to me.
Yeah, and you make a great point too. When you said first generation, immigrant. Here, she just became a naturalized citizen in 1900, and so, it really didn't have much invested in the country, right? I mean, but they were so willing to give their sons, and I think one of the in the book, one thing that really points that out. Is after the war, in 1948, they finally got all four boys home, and they had the church service, and then right after the church service, they had a luncheon, and one of the notable guys that was at the service was General Mark Clark, and we know during World War II, he served as the commander of the Fifth Army, and so he was actually very active with the funeral service, and there's a photograph in the book that at the luncheon it shows General Mark Clark sitting right next to Gunda, and right next to Gunda, of course, is her husband Alvin. So now they just got done with the funeral service at the church with the four flag line coffins, and they're at this luncheon, and Gunda had this pressing question that she just needed answered. And so the opportunity arose when she's sitting next to General Mark Clark, and she leans over and she kind of quietly says to General Mark Clark, please don't take my youngest. Now, her youngest was Eldon, and he was too young to serve in World War II, but now he was 19 years old. And General Mark Clark, he was to some degree kind of caught off guard with the question, and he told Gunda, he said, well, essentially, I'll do the best I can, and if war does break out, I will do. He said, I will do my best to protect him, but I can't make any certain promises.
I'm interrupting the podcast right now to make a plug for our Arlington project. We're in the middle of it right now. We're hoping to get these done by the 4th of July, and there's so many amazing stories here to be found. So if you are new to the project, please visit storiesbehindthestars.org and click the volunteer button. If you've already been a volunteer and you've just kind of gotten busy, consider giving a little bit more of your time and contacting us to get some names to start doing research for these Arlington stories. They're quite phenomenal, and just be part of a really amazing national project. And then also, if you're new to the podcast, please consider subscribing so that when we put out new episodes, you can be notified and you can listen to these really awesome stories as we're finding them.
Well, so Albin had overheard this, and when after the general spoke, he leaned over to his wife and he said, Mother, he said, if our youngest one must go, he will, and I will make no such promises to keep him out of the war. So that's when you think about how remarkable that is and how enduring that is. They're burying their 4 boys, and now offering in some ways that if something else were to happen, they would willingly send their youngest son. So,
wow. So that's like to the Korean conflict. That was, obviously did end up happening. Wow.
Yes.
That's amazing.
Yes.
That's amazing. I think there just was this a different way of viewing life back then. It's just like, it really was something that maybe we don't really understand. I think with the Ukrainian conflict happening, people are like, oh, wow, this is maybe understanding a little bit, connecting. You see some of those stories of men who are staying behind and getting their family out and things
Absolutely.
like that. And you think about, like, why are these men doing this? Like, why are these people doing this? And, I had the opportunity to live in the former Soviet Union, and my brother lived in Ukraine for a while. And
wow,
one of the things we've talked a lot about it because it's pretty upsetting to us to see this happening. But one of the things we're like, it's worth fighting for the freedom to have your children make their own choices in life.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And I think that's something that, because we've been so free for so long, that we don't understand it's worth dying so my child can have the ability to be free. And I think that they understood that to a degree that maybe, we need some refreshing, which is, I think, another really powerful thing about this book is they're like, why did this family do this? And it's really refreshing to see. And you tell the story about the letter that she was gifted with Abraham Lincoln. I think that's really interesting.
Yeah. So that was, there was and that's actually where the title of the book was from. A So-Called Sacrifice was from Lincoln's letter. And, there was a gentleman, he was a president of the local railroad, in I think it's Magna, Utah, and he had read about, and he had a copy of Lincoln's letter to Miss Bigsby, who was thought to have lost 5 sons in the Civil War. And so this letter was written by President Lincoln to Miss Bigsby. Well, this gentleman, he read in the newspaper, he read an article about this family, who had lost, at the time they knew they had lost 3 sons. And he was so taken by this article that he actually took his copy of the Bigsby letter and presented that to Albin and Gunda. And it's just, again, just a show of how well respected and loved this family was. And so, yeah.
Yeah, I love that letter. Like, he talks about so costly a sacrifice on the altars of freedom, I think is.
Yes.
I don't know the whole quote
No,
exactly.
you got it.
But,
no, you're exactly right. Yeah. Yes, absolutely.
I feel like that is really a poignant thing to remember, about how, there's like this, there is an altar of freedom, and to just think about what that is, requires to keep that and keep us free. I think it's really quite poignant.
Absolutely. Yes. Yeah.
So can you give us a little bit of background on the boys, like where they served or what necessarily happened to them? You don't have to tell us everything, but just a little bit, like some of their background, so our listeners can kind of know what happened to the boys.
Sure. So there were 5 of their sons at the time, and I, as I say in the book, I mean, it was a large family, but, we have to remember in those days, especially in Utah, where farming was a way of life, and I say, they raised their own help. So ultimately they had 10 children, and they knew, they just knew, heartache from the very beginning. And I say that because their very first child, his name was Ferran, he actually died at the age of 10 of a ruptured appendix in the farmhouse. Back then they didn't have hospitals, and so, they had no means to get him there. And, so they knew tragedy, from the very beginning. And so the 5 boys that served, 2 were Marines, Clyde and Boyd. They were the first ones. They were the first ones to enlist, and they enlisted in 1940 and enlisted at the exact, on the very same day. Their serial numbers are exactly 1 apart. And so they actually joined, obviously, before the war began. And then Leroy was actually the oldest son. And one striking thing about Leroy was he hated, think about, in that time, mostly they hunted for their food, but Leroy had hated guns. He always did. So when he went into the Army, he served as a medic. And then there was the 2 twins. They were just 18 years old at the time, Roland and Rulon. And it was just shortly after high school graduation that they entered the service. And Roland actually went into the Army Air Corps, and Rulon ended up serving in the infantry in the 69th Division. And so.
So just to clarify, none of them were drafted; they all volunteered.
That's correct. Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so they Clyde and Boyd. Boyd was actually the first son to leave the shores of the U.S., and he served on Johnston Island for about 16 months. When he returned, Clyde actually went. Then he went to Guadalcanal, and that was pretty much after all the fighting was over. So he served on Guadalcanal, and he was the first one. He was the first one to be killed, and that was in March of 1944. After his death, Leroy was the second son, and he served as a medic, and he was in Italy just about a month. And he was actually killed while carrying a wounded soldier to safety, and that was he was just, when he was killed, and he was June 22nd of 44. He was 30 years old, and then. After Leroy, in August of 44, Roland, who was serving as a tail gunner on a B-24, he was killed actually, and he was killed actually in England. An interesting story about that was he served the plane that he served on at the time of his death was kind of nicknamed the Flying Log, and the original name of the plane was Pregnant Peg. Now, so he never served on Pregnant Peg, and but when in early 44, the crew of the Pregnant Peg, they flew on a mission deep into Germany, and when they after dropping their bombs, they headed back. They were headed back to England, and the plane got shot up pretty bad. Well, it lost most of its hydraulics, but luckily enough, the plane was able to get it. They were able to get the plane back to Shipton, which was the air base where they were stationed at. And so, but when they got back, the landing gear didn't work because all the hydraulics were shot out. And so when the plane came in for landing, it pretty much crash landed, but it chewed up, badly damaged the bottom of the plane. So they decided to repair the plane, and they took it to the repair depot. And what they did is they actually lashed a telephone pole in the bottom of the plane to stiffen the structure of the plane. And they put it back in service, and hence the name Flying Log. But he was it was his fifth mission that he served on the Flying Log, and they were headed out for a mission. They were going to bomb an airfield, I believe it was in Romilly, and they developed engine trouble. And so they had to head back. And I'll leave the rest of the story for those who read the book. So, and then the fourth son was Roulin, and he was serving in France, and he was killed on August 25th, just 2 weeks after his twin brother was killed.